All right, welcome to a Docker AMA. I'm kind of making these things up as I go along. I'm calling it Late Night Docker because it is late here in the East Coast, and I'm working through some Ask Me Anythings. So I have a GitHub AMA that I will share. Let's share a screen. Sweet. Okay, so I have an AMA for popular questions that people ask in the courses and other things, mostly Docker stuff, but it can be just about anything. And the second topic on here is around Docker node good defaults. So I have a repo for Node, and it's under github.com/Brett Fisher, node Docker good defaults. I will probably put something in here about that. And this repo is a sample project in Node. I've had it for a couple of years. It's probably needs a little bit of refreshing, but the goal here is that when you're a developer in Docker, you're not just you can't use it as a simple setup. You usually need a little bit of whiz-bang stuff, especially with Docker Compose, in order to get all the bells and whistles you want out of a better experience, or at least an equal experience to developing on your local machine without Docker. So I thought I might go through this file, maybe explain a few things and make it more interesting than reading through the file. So let's jump in. I've got the Node project over here. It's I think it's up to date. Yep, it's up to date. And not everything you could possibly do. This is sort of the minimal feature set that you'd want to do if you're developing locally on Node. It doesn't really matter what version of Node, Node 6 or anything newer. There's little minor stuff like this is not even required, but it's in there for verbosity. We've got Node environment variables. And so Node normally has a developer production in it that affects what packages and how it runs. And so you usually want that in your Dockerfile. And you can set this, it's designed so that you can set this on your local machine, either in the compose file or as an environment variable, and it will dynamically pick it up when you build. And then it'll also pick it up. Notice that's the arg there. That's how it uses it for building. And then you have an environment variable that's set for when you actually run it. By the way, if you have questions, you can ask them in the Slack or in the YouTubes. And warning, I have no idea what I'm doing. And let's jump through each couple of lines here. So we got ports. Now, debugging is something that just about every framework works with in Docker now, especially it's a little harder on Mac and Windows, or has been. But if the debugger for your platform or your ecosystem supports ports so that you can connect to the debugger through a port, then it'll totally work in Docker. And even if it doesn't use a port, which now I'm not even sure there are any, is still probably a way to map a file if it uses some sort of socket or something. So in this case, the debug ports for Node are exposed here so that we can get them. By the way, the expose command since version 2 of Compose doesn't really do anything. It's there only for documentation purposes. When you use Docker or Compose, any port that's listed in the container is always exposed in the network. That's not related to publishing of ports. That's a totally different thing. But we all still put them in the Dockerfiles just for documentation purposes. So health check is not critical for local development, but I put it in here because it's important for every one of your Docker files. If you're using Docker in production or Docker Swarm in particular, health checks are key. They're necessary for updates. I won't go into the whole rolling update thing, but if you're going to use Swarm ever, you have to have a health check. Otherwise, when you do updates, Docker or Linux in general doesn't know how to know when your app is ready, because there's a difference between starting a binary and that binary being ready and available for connections. And that, depending on your platform and your ecosystem, may be minutes or seconds. Node usually is less than a few seconds. If you're on Java and you're doing some caching on PHP or something, you could talk about potentially minutes if it's got a long startup script. So you want that health check in there so that it doesn't start sending connections in production before the container's ready. Anyway, moving on. So we've got our work directory. We're going to be using an opt directory just to keep it sort of Linux standard there. And then we're copying in the package first. And of course, this is probably a common 101 thing is anytime you have a package manager, you always copy in the package manager file first, and then you run the package manager, and then you copy in your code. And that's simply for build caching. So if I'm over here and I actually build this, let's see. Hopefully that'll work. So it will pull down node, the latest node if I don't have it, and then it runs through here. So you'll notice that there's an order of these steps. And when I get to the NPM one, it's going to copy in the package file, and then it's going to run the installation. So the goal here, we don't have we have the verbosity turned off. It looks like there must be a new NPM feature, so it doesn't show the entire list of installs. So that's a new thing. This NPM install is there because if I change my code, I don't want to have to reinstall packages when I build. If you're on anything like NPM Composer for PHP, really any of the package managers, these can take minutes and minutes to install. And just because I change code, which I'm changing constantly, doesn't mean I want to reinstall those packages. And each line of Dockerfile is a new layer in the file system. And if a higher level line changes, it will wipe out the cache that it has in the background of all the next lines, and it will sort of what we call a cache busting event. And that means that anytime your package changes, your package JSON changes, it's going to have to do the npm install again. And you'll notice that it says here, well, it doesn't say it now, but if I run it again, it's going to say using cache on each one of these steps. And that's why that only took a second, because it looks at the cache. Does the cache match what that command tells me to do? If yes, use cache. And if I don't put these in this order before I actually copy in my code, then every time I have to build my image, I have to wait on the npm install. We usually change our packages 1/100th of the time of actually code, at least. So you always want to do that first. And in this case, we're actually we're copying in any package log file as well. We put that asterisk on the end in case there's any other type of file there. I'm trying to think, actually, there's a very specific reason that that's there. It might even be in the issues. We talked about it because that was actually a user adding stuff. So I can't remember exactly why that's there off the top of my head. But after that, you want to make sure you always clean up. So most package managers cache packages. If we want to make a nice clean image that's very small, we want to do whatever that we need to do, whether that's an apt-get or that's an npm or a composer. We want to clean out those files before we go to the next line, because the next line, if we cleaned it out, would not actually go to the previous layer. Because remember, this is like a stack of pancakes, layers on the pancake. And if I go to the next layer in the pancake, I can't go back up and delete stuff out of the previous layer. So that would mean that all those caches would still be there, regardless of what happens on the next line. Anyway, we update our path here. And this gets around a problem that's common in package manager frameworks like npm, where the default is to put packages in a subdirectory of your app. That's a problem for local development. When you do local development in Docker, you're bind mounting in, and we'll look at the compose file in a second. But when you bind mount in your code from your host into the container, you don't usually want the packages shared between the host and then in the container. And that's usually, mostly, an issue on Mac and Windows, because we have binaries, and binaries in those packages that install on Mac will not run in a Linux container. Those are two separate compilations. So we need the Linux packages to be in the Linux container. This is weird when you're jumping code in from your host, because your host might already have npm packages there, or maybe you're in the container and you install packages, and then it would copy those into the host bind mount. If you can follow that workflow, you would then have Linux packages stored on your Mac or Windows that wouldn't be able to run if you ever ran Node on your host. So we don't want any of that. The way around that is to use your package manager to change where it's going to install the packages. That, in this case, what we do here is, actually, let me jump over to the compose file and show you what that looks like. Compose. This is a little workaround that we do. And so when we install our packages, we're going to install those in a different directory than our app. So when you look, if you were to dive into the container and the image, you would see that the packages are under opt. Actually, let me make sure I'm saying this correctly. You know what? We don't do that in this one. Okay, backing up. There's two ways you can do this. I used to do it this way in this repo, but based on a user contribution, we changed it to be a little more efficient for Node. I still do it this way in PHP. So let me explain both ways. The way here, we're actually still installing the binaries and the packages into the subdirectory for development. No, we're not. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Don't ever listen to me on Late Night Docker. All right. First, let's just step through it. It'll make sense. We're going to jump into the opt directory, not in the app directory. So we're a higher directory level up. We're going to install packages there. Then we're going to add that package binary path to our environment path so that we know how to get to any binaries that are in the Node modules, like nodemon, for example, which we'll use in a minute. And this gets us to the point where we're copying in code, and we're then going to jump in a subdirectory. So if I were to look into that image and do Node, sorry for the confusion. There are two ways to do this, and certain projects I use it two different ways. Node 01. All right. So this is my app. It's in opt app. I would normally see a Node modules on a normal Node app by default in this directory, but I don't see it because it's up one. And if you've ever used Node, this is a little bit odd, but it's totally supported by Node. Node allows you to change where your modules are located. It will by default look in the current directory always. And then if it doesn't find it, it will then start looking in paths. And there's a sort of a breakdown. If you go look at the Node, the NPM and Node documentation, they will explain that there's an order to where it looks based on path rules and higher directories and all that stuff. So this is the next best place for us to put it parallel to the app. The gain we have here is now we don't have this confliction of any Node modules that I might have installed on my Mac that aren't going to be binary compatible inside a Linux container. So the Linux packages are in here, and my Mac packages will stay on my Mac. The way that we avoid a problem is with this when we're doing local development. And this was a user submission. There's actually a note here about it. And we're making a fake or a unused volume. It's not really a fake volume, an unused volume, and mapping it into where we would normally have our Node modules. So these two pieces work together, and they're key to get right together. First, we are going to put the correct node modules in a different location outside of our app. And then we are going to make sure that when we bind mount with compose, that we don't actually introduce a new problem by bringing in our Mac or Windows packages. And that's because you probably, if you're a Node developer, you probably are sometimes developing with Node on your host. Node works on Mac, Windows, Linux. It works across all three. Maybe you're using it on the native OS. So if I was on my native OS and I did an npm install, it's going to put all those packages in the subdirectory of my app, right? So I've got this node modules there. That's a problem when I bind mount it into the container, because the way that Node works is that it will first look at the directory of my app. And if there's any node modules in there, it will prefer those first. But I don't want it to do that because that will fail. It will be using binaries that are incompatible with Linux because they're from my Mac. So that's what this does. This little volume here gets us around that issue by basically making a fake volume. And if you didn't know, when you use volumes inside containers, they don't actually erase the files where you're putting them or mounting them. It just overrides. It's kind of like a shadow, or I'm not sure the right analogy there. But in Linux, it's a mount, and a mount can go over any other location on the file system. And then when that mount leaves, the old files come back. Like, it's not really erasing or deleting. So what I'm saying here is, it just in case if on my host I have a node modules directory in my app, hide it by putting it in a volume. And when I do that, the volume will be empty, and there won't be anything there. So we're sort of overriding that. Getting back to the file, hopefully that makes sense. We are with the whole node modules thing. And now that when we copy in our app code, we're going to copy that into the app directory so that it sits parallel with our node modules. Then we're going to just run our node command. You're probably used to running npm start. That's a standard practice in node land. And I'm not a fan of that. I explain a little bit why it's here, because when you're in Docker, you ideally want, when you do your Docker run, for the command, the CMD, to be running the binary of your service and not some other binary that then runs your binary, and and that you have this nested sub binary tree. You don't really ideally want that. You want Docker to just run the single binary you need and not something else. We might lose npm start's ability for you to run automated stuff in your package file. So if I went in to another window and looked at the package file, if I had scripts in here like I do, obviously I can't just take advantage of those. So it's a little bit of a negative, because if you have a team that's used to adding more scripts to their package files and just running npm commands, that will not work here, because it's going to be running the node directly, and it's skipping out on the benefits of npm. The big problem here is, and why we do this, is Node and npm aren't savvy with signals that are coming out of Linux by default. They don't, out of the box, without any extra code, and we'll go about the code in a minute, if they don't have any extra code in there, when you do like a Control-C, you won't actually exit out. Or if you do a sig term, it won't properly stop Node. And you'll notice that if you run any Node containers, and then when you do maybe a Control-C or you do a stop on a container, it takes about 10 seconds. And that is because Docker's trying to stop it gracefully. Node's not listening. And so Docker has to kill it. And Docker's standard wait time for killing something is 10 seconds. So if you ever see that in containers and it seems like it's always waiting 10 seconds before responding, that's because you have a signaling problem. And the way to solve that in Node is to, step one, not use npm, because npm doesn't forward signals, unfortunately. And two, in your code, which we have an example here, in the actual code of our app, you need to handle signals. Now, I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second if you're not savvy to signal management in your processes of Node, and you're going to be doing distributed Node, meaning distributed computing, even if you're not using containers, you should get into signaling, because signaling allows you to gracefully shut down Node. And when I say gracefully, I mean receive a signal from the operating system or Docker, whichever one's telling it to stop, and decide what you want to do. Do you want to wait for all the connections to finish? Maybe you have long polling and you want to wait for those long polls to finish, or you have streams that are happening and you want to wait for those to finish uploading. Maybe you want to clean up certain connections or things. If you want to do any of that, you have to process signals that are coming in. That's how you do a proper shutdown of Node. Most projects I work with don't ever look into this, and they don't realize that when they change things on the fly in their production environment, whether you're using Docker or Kubernetes or AWS's, ASGs, or whatever you're using, if you're using any of that stuff, you're probably cutting off your users. Unless you're just running a static website that's doing nothing but serving a static web page that they can just refresh, you're going to be affecting somebody somewhere on the internet, unless you do proper graceful shutdown. So in distributed computing, graceful shutdown is something you need to be concerned about. We're used to that stuff in databases and other things where we have to worry about these long-running connections. But the more we get into long polling and WebSockets and those sorts of things, this becomes a real problem here too. So I have a simple little example. It doesn't handle all edge cases, but it shows how I can quickly capture the signals coming in from Docker, either using a SIGINT or a SIGTERM. And I even put a little console message out that tells you whether it got a container stop or it got a container control C, maybe from your actual keyboard. And it accepts those two signals and then processes a shutdown on the server. This doesn't handle any sort of special waiting on users to finish their connections, or giving a termination signal to connections or that sort of thing. I'm not doing that for you. There's lots of examples on the internet, depending on which things you're doing in Node. Maybe you're not even running a Node server and it's something else that you need to gracefully shut down. But that's my soapbox. Distributed computing, which usually implies that you're changing things and rolling updates a lot, you're probably going to need to care about this at some point. And I give you that example. So Docker is going to handle that here. And that's not so much a concern for development, but that will affect your control C. So if you're running without this stuff in here, and you then do something like this, if I'm in Node and I do a Docker, let's see, let me do a Docker run. Let me just do that. Okay, running my web server. I did not put it in the background with the -d command, so it's in the front. Normally with Node, if I'm using Node or NPM, if I controlled C right now, nothing would happen for 10 seconds. But when I did it there, you'll notice that I got my message, my little SIGINT, and that's because I captured it up here, and that caused it to run the function to shut down the server. So that's a simple little example on how I put that in every project that I know is going to be in Node, simply so that Control C works, and that when I do a Docker stop, it doesn't take 10 seconds to kill the app. And that's something that's pretty simple to do. There's if you go into Node's issues for the Node and NPM repositories, they actually have, there's lots of people that file GitHub issues around wishing that there was a default SIGTERM or SIGINT built into those, and there's a debate back and forth on whether they're going to put that in. As far as I know, it's still not in there, so you have to put this in your app. All right, so we're done with the Dockerfile, and let's jump over to the Compose and throw in a few more things, and then we're done. So I'm opening up my debug ports. That's a common thing you want to do in Compose, is to make sure the debug ports are there. If you're using something like, well, there's the built-in Node debuggers, the old one and the new one. And if you're using something like Visual Studio Code that actually can connect to the debugger and show it to you in a nice GUI, these are what helps make that work. They are required to make that work. There's both the old port and the new port. The new port, I believe, is this 9229 there. And then you'll notice that I've got this command in here. So what this is doing is this is for local development only, changing my CMD, changing the default command that my Dockerfile is running, because I want to watch files for changes. If I'm developing, I do not want to have to restart Docker every time I edit and save a file. It's crazy, especially if you do like build. Like you don't want to have to build or do anything. I just want basically my page to refresh. So, or at least the closest thing to it. So nodemon doesn't technically get my web app to refresh. It refreshes the node app in the container without restarting the container. That saves you if you run nodemon on the host and you have nodemon restarting the Docker container every time, which I've seen people do, that adds at least a half a second, if not a full second, to the restart. So this is faster doing it in the container. And so I do a nodemon in here and I replace the command that we had, which was node index.js. I'm replacing that with nodemon. Nodemon actually pulls from the package.js, I believe. So it knows to use index.js. And I'm telling it to enable the inspector so that in case I want to do some debugging, I can connect to that port and it'll work. And this way, because I'm using this volume from my host into my container will then auto refresh the Node app every time. It'll auto restart Node each time I change a file. Key for any developer who's spending their days in Node. It would be a headache without. The last thing you'll notice here is that little delegated on the end. That's actually, I think, one of the latest changes suggested by one of the fans of this repo. Delegated is only currently a feature for Mac, and it has to do with file I/O performance, because in Windows and Mac, these are all running in a little VM called Moby that runs in the background, and there's this layer in the file system of sharing that has to go on. It's better on Mac than it is on Windows because Windows has to use SMB file sharing, which is still kind of sucky and slow. It's better than it used to be, but not as good as Mac and definitely not as good as Linux. On Mac, because Mac has that native Linux-esque file system, there's a tighter integration. And in that case, we have these options. And if you just go look it up on Docker, they actually have a lot of information. Mac, Docker, delegated, performance tuning for Mac. And so there's options here that you can choose. By default, it's the safe set. It will make sure that files on both the Mac and in the Linux container are all the I/O is caught up before it will try to do things. And normally, if we're just writing files on the host and we're reading them in the container like you do with development, you don't really need that fully consistent I/O pattern. And we're talking about microseconds, like sub-nanosecond stuff, right? This is not something you have to worry about in production, because when you're natively on Linux or natively on Windows containers, if you're doing that, those things are native to the OS. They're using the same kernel to manage the file system. In this case, we've got a Linux kernel and a Mac kernel trying to agree on file I/O and which file needs to be changed next. And so we're using this delegated option, which gives us a better performing developer experience. It allows for us to do npm installs that are faster, and it's basically allowing a looser coupling of the I/O patterns so that things can happen faster in the container, and we'll wait for the host OS to catch up later. You can read more about those there, but for development, this option for delegated is just fine. Let me find my tab there. So that's going to work. And again, it won't hurt anything to have that in there if you're on Windows. If you're in a team, always put this in so that your Mac people get better performance. Your Windows people, it just ignores it. It just doesn't even use that option on the end. And we're bind mounting the existing directory. Again, we talked about that down here. And then I'm changing my node environment to development. So that way, when my app starts up, it sees that the node environment variable is development, in case you depend on that in your app for setting changes or doing certain things based on production or development. Whew. I think that's it for 99% of what's in here, and hopefully will help your node apps perform better. There's actually a few issues here that I've thrown in over this timeline. The sigterm int thing, in case you're wanting to help out, I could totally use some help. I need someone to validate that the current versions of VS Code actually work with the inspect and debug options. I'm not sure how much people are using the older debug option anymore, but it would be nice if we knew that it worked in most cases. And then we have the sigterm option here. This is pretty cool, where if you're doing long polling or WebSockets or something where the connections never end up finishing, they're just there always. We don't have the example in here supporting those edge cases. So it would be cool if someone could come up with a agreed upon standard sort of unopinionated way of having that in here in this demo app, because it's using Express. This demo app's using Express as a server, web server. So it would be nice if we had a little more intelligence and maybe even more examples in the code, even if they're just commented out, on how you might deal with closing out sessions. Because I think that needs to be talked about more. Most people are not realizing that their users are getting interrupted when they do updates of their containers or updates of their apps. So I try to give some information here. I'd love some help on that if anyone has the time. Other than that, I'm going to check in on Slack and see if we have some questions. That's a really long video. No questions. All right, I'm gonna try this again later on and see if we can't do this more often and have some fun. All right, thanks for watching.